Stanford University.
Well, Tom, we had an opportunity for some great stories about how you ended up coming to Stanford. So now we've got you from becoming one of the rare initial appointments as associate professor. Now you're here at Stanford. What happened?
Okay. So let me go a little slow there. One of the issues was where were we going to live?
Oh.
So what happened is, I was in Berkeley till June, and Sarah got pregnant at that time, and she went back to India for a few months because she was missing her family. And so at some event somehow I met someone called Larry Thomas, who was a faculty resident in Wilbur Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we spoke, he said, we're going away for a quarter in the fall of '63, and would Sarah and you like to be residents? So our first time was with 90 freshmen in Madeira Hall, in Madeira House in Wilbur.
With a young baby? Is that right?
No, baby was born in December.
December.
I'll tell you the story about that too. It was a very interesting group of people. It was changing group. Diverse group, not as diverse as nowadays, but one of the people in the class was Bill Stone.
Oh, from the Alumni Association.
Right.
Recently retired. Yes, I know Bill. Yes.
He came from a famous banking family.
Yes.
You know that. Another was Harris. No, I forget his name now. He came from Massachusetts. He was a Boilermaker's son. He was active in the 67, 68 events at Stanford. I forget his name. Not David Harris, it was something else.
Was he involved when there were the riots and things?
Yes, around that time.
Yes,
I don't know the details. We were away for some of it. So it was a very interesting class. And, our first exposure, Sarah, new bride, she was 21. In '62, she was 21. And surrounded by all these young people. It was very interesting. And she got to know them. As fact, their mother knew their birthdays, baked them cakes and so on. I would give quizzes, she would bake cookies for the students and so on. And one of the incidents was one day we were walking back into the dorm. Everyone was glued to the TV. It was November 22nd.
Oh, that's a bad day.
Kennedy.
Yes.
So that was sad. Then the baby was coming along, and the students had a pool to guess when
on the day and time the baby would be born?
Guess who won it?
Did you? No.
No, I wasn't in the pool.
Who?
Bill Stone.
Oh, Bill Stone. Next time I see Bill, I'm going to ask him that.
Right.
In fact, I just saw him a few weeks ago. I should have asked him. Now I have a question to ask him.
Right. So that was Bill Stone. So that was that. Then baby was born early in December, and in those days we bought a home. We knew that we could live on campus, but no new place was opening up. And so we said, we'll wait. They said, in a few years, a place is opening up. And finally, in '67, it opened up.
A place being a house or to build a house?
To build a house.
To build a house.
To build a house,
right.
Yeah. There were homes. We looked at some of them. So we bought a place in Sunnyvale. It was an Eichler home, which appealed to us because a lot of light and so on. India, full of light and so on. So that was good. But we couldn't afford the Eichler in Palo Alto. It was $10,000 more than in Sunnyvale. And moreover, we didn't quite have the down payment, so the broker loaned us some money.
The broker?
Or the realtor.
Really?
Yeah, to meet the down payment.
Interesting.
Interesting. Times are different.
Yeah, I'll say they're different.
$28,000.
Times are definitely different.
But it was a nice community because close by were a couple of Stanford PhD of Norm Abramson's, Phil Fire and Stan Freilich, and they helped us settle down.
Nice community.
Phil Fire, you may remember. Yes. And Nelson Blackman was nearby. He worked at Sylvania. So the first course I taught was, I think we still had only one course per quarter, was I'd always wanted, I'd never taught before, to put together my ideas on transform analysis and linear systems and so on. And I should go back. One of my characteristics, and I used to encourage my students to do that, is, when you learn a subject, a lot of facts are being thrown at you, and you are never quite sure how they fit together with what you already know and so on. So what I used to do was I would collect the lectures, think about them, and say, if I was teaching this material for myself, how would I organize it?
Yes.
And so I would redo this. So I would redo the subject,
Good.
break it down, and build it up again in a way that fitted my own mental framework.
Right.
So on. And I'd encourage my students, each of us has a different mental frame. There are some facts we know very well, some we don't. Put them together.
Good.
And this showed up in my books and so on. I'll give you some quotations later. So I introduced this course, putting together my ideas on
this. It's a new course. It hadn't existed.
A new course. It had never been taught before. And it was a hit. It was called EE 240.
Oh, I know that course. Yes, I remember that name.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
It was a hit. And a year later, John Linville had to write a letter removing the acting from my title.
He was then chair.
Yes. Yeah, by 64, Linville was chair.
Right.
When I came in 63, Skilling was still chair.
Yes.
Linville was away, I think, still on sabbatical.
Right.
I forget when he became chair, but early in 64. And Jim Gibbons then researched this and showed me that Linville had written, no, his teaching is going well. In fact, he introduced a new course, which almost all graduate students in the department take. So that was a lucky,
That's
good
really
beginning.
Good. Really
and
good.
then the next quarter I taught a course on related to my research. I forget what it was called, Gaussian communication channels or something. And that was more advanced, of course, but related to the work that I did in my thesis and was continuing to do. And that is one, in many ways, I sometimes think how foolish if I had turned down the Stanford offer, because at Stanford was sort of the perfect fit for me at the time. Okay, because many years later when I wrote a book, I thanked John, in the acknowledgments, I thanked John Linville and Ralph Smith
Yes.
for providing the productive environment at Stanford, I'm quoting somewhat from memory, which allowed a creative interaction between research and teaching.
Yeah.
Because, and Terman, this is a philosophy that Terman had said. Many people ask me, what is it that Terman contributed? What were all the secrets he had? And there were many, or not secrets, his special things he did. Times have changed, so I'm not politically correct when I talk about this. But Terman, if I may say, said the following: we have to build up Stanford and make it visible so that we attract good faculty, good students, and money.
Yes.
And so we must focus on being visible, so we must encourage research in our faculty, and their teaching could be related to their research because they reinforce each other.
That's right. Right.
Yeah. And there's a quote I'd like to mention. Again, it's not entirely accurate, but from memory. There's a famous computer scientist called Edsger Dijkstra.
Yes.
You know
Yes,
the name
yes,
also.
I do.
Okay. And once he wrote that a scientific discipline is not just any odd collection of facts, of results, odd collection of results, and an equally odd collection of skills. But the skills have to improve the knowledge, and in turn the knowledge has to refine the skills. So you go back and forth. So you're doing research, you're trying to teach that sort of material, you get insights, etc., and goes back.
Right.
I think Terman had that kind of thing in mind, and he didn't mind if the master's curriculum at Stanford did not cover all the bases. Because as I understand it, and I did have a conversation with people about these, he said, the students can fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
You teach them what you know best, excite them about learning, get them to know how to learn. And so compared to MIT or Berkeley, our curriculum had gaps in it. But that, I think, in retrospect, that's fine. We tend to teach too much, is what I've been learning over the years. I was guilty of that because when I came to MIT, to Stanford, it was the quarter system. MIT had the semesters. And I was so young and ambitious and immature, I would attempt to teach a semester's worth.
16 weeks and 10 weeks?
14 weeks.
You're 14.
Yeah, right.
You're poor students.
The classes were challenging, but, I think I pride myself on being clear. Like, not everybody agrees, but by and large, I was a reasonable teacher. And Ralph Smith would straighten you out if you... I remember a famous story that Krishna Saraswat tells me. Yeah. He was more on the solid state side, but I was teaching this linear systems course, and the first part was Fourier. And I assigned 30 problems or 40 problems, the first or second homework set. And he said, no, that's too much. And Ralph Smith brought her, I said, they were all very short problems, so once you got into the swing of it, you could do it.
Yes.
But he said, no, take it easy a bit. So that was an interesting course, and I started to write a book about it, which integrated my research. And then I had an even more advanced course on stochastic processes.
Yes.
And this is one of the mistakes I made because I had 10 students, 8 or 10 students, and each of them had to write, it was a semi-seminar type of course, a term paper. Now I was new, and I didn't, and the guidelines were that you must give 40% A's and 40% B's and C's. So I made the mistake of following that protocol for these 8 students. And I know that they all worked hard, they did a good job, but 2 of them had to get C's.
That's
and
right.
They were quite unhappy about it, and they were quite good students. Later I thought I should have given all A's. Skilling may have hauled me up, but so that was one of my early mistakes.
Over time, did you change your
No, I
approach to grading?
changed, and sometimes I would just violate the rules. But I generally graded on a curve.
Yes.
Yeah. And Subhashis Mitra tells me once, many years later, I taught a course on Fourier analysis from Bracewell's course.
Ron Bracewell's course.
Ron Bracewell, one of my influences on me at Stanford early. And Subhashis, the midterm happened to be very tough. So a large number of students didn't make it, including him. But then he is always proudly tells me, repeats it, he got an A+ on the final. So I had learned and I was there, yeah.
That's funny.
So, yeah.
It's interesting. So you came in, your research areas, I know that you came from a math background, but you always tried to move...
Engineer, right.
Engineer.
I'm not a mathematician.
I know you're not a mathematician,
Right.
but you have strong foundations of mathematics.
And I like to use mathematics to solve engineering problems. And once it's only math for its own sake, I rarely do it. I drop it and move on to something else. And that has happened.
Yes.
I've had to learn some quite advanced mathematics to do engineering results. And then the math got even more sophisticated and narrow, and I moved out and some other people used to continue. So I always like to relate the math to some potential application.
When you first came to Stanford, what was the research? You were working on still communications, or were you
detection theory,
control theory?
Signal detection. No, not control.
Okay.
That came later.
Later.
As Jim Gibbons once wrote that, do you remember that? Should I quote some of it?
No, go ahead.
Jim Gibbons, I'm a great admirer of Jim Gibbons. And my short characterization of Jim Gibbons is, whatever he does well, whatever he does well. He wrote a beautiful letter for me, 3 short paragraphs on the occasion of my 60th birthday, when my students had organized a 5-day.
I've read that letter, but please tell us.
You've read that
It's
letter,
a very good letter.
Right, very
and funny, and
so crisp,
yes.
and people read and say he's communicated so much information in a few. He works at these things.
Yes,
and I've heard him on many occasions. He works hard at these things.
Jim was my boss for many years, and
Right.
I have great admiration for exactly that. He's very precise and very good at communicating. Very good.
Great communicator. So he said, Tom, your career has been an outstanding success at Stanford many times over and for a different set of reasons each decade. So control was my second decade.
Right.
Though I'm well known in the control field.
Right.
Yeah.
But my recollection of the letter is he then said, "We hope you can stay around for a long time. There's much more to do."
That's right, exactly. Yeah, he's he said, we like your infectious life. He hit all the bases.
So were you able to quickly get a gathering of
Good
students to help you?
Yes, very good.
Yes.
I'll tell you about it. My first. So anyway, this atmosphere at Stanford, which allowed you to integrate your teaching and research, enabled not only me, but a number of our faculty to focus and no master's thesis.
That's right.
I'm comparing with MIT,
Which
where
requires
the
it,
master's
yes.
thesis is a big drag on the faculty. There's a bachelor's thesis too.
Yes.
And my son-in-law is an MIT professor, and I know what he's, and many of my friends are. So Stanford was wise in that regard. I might say, the qualifying exam requirements at MIT are much more rigorous than here. They're much more extensive. I won't bother you. They've lightened them up since I was there, but there's still more. But it's a big drain on the faculty. And as a result, I keep telling people, the average MIT PhD is better trained than the average Stanford PhD. But the top PhDs are the same, equal caliber at both schools, which is not surprising, but it is. And I think term and philosophy was that we are known by your stars, and they attract more stars and so on. So this is, I think this is among the things that, in '63 when I came, they had just launched PACE, something called PACE, $100 million campaign, sounds negligible, Program of Action for a Challenging Era. Wally Sterling and Fred Terman.
Yes.
PACE. And that's how they built. And then Terman had this idea that if you got research money and paid, say, up to half your salary, we could get another professor.
That's right.
So almost till the day I retired, I offset 50% of my salary.
They liked you.
I was, it got harder.
It's also the interesting approach that Fred Terman uses, his steeples of excellence concept, right? Where we're not going to be good at everything, but those areas where we can be, we'll be the best.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, we get the best. And that was his philosophy, well-known phrase. It worked. So, so if we go, my first PhD student was 2 years younger than me. Piet Schalkwijk, he came from Holland. He just retired a few years ago as a professor in Delft. Yeah. And he did a thesis in information theory. Information theory has the pure information theory called Shannon theory, what Shannon did, and signal detection, which is somewhat older. The Russians were there early, and which was my thesis was mostly about that. But we did a paper on feedback communications, which someone wrote a review in Science magazine. He says this Kailath Schalkwijk paper rocked the information theory community, because the holy grail of information theory was sending information through a channel at its capacity, at its maximum capacity. Okay. Till about the 1960s, nobody managed to find a scheme that could do that. Okay. They came to about 1/3 of the way. Jack Wozencraft came 1/3 of the way, and so on. I had at MIT in this summer course that I taught, Peter Elias gave a talk on channels with feedback, where you have a link from A to B is noisy. Talking to a spacecraft, you have a lot of power on the ground, low power on the satellite. You can send a very strong signal to the satellite, but they can't send you a strong signal. So if they collect data out in the troposphere or near the planet and so on, they send you a noisy signal which you have the capability to decode, but you can essentially send information back to them noiseless because you have such a strong channel. How do you exploit that channel? Peter, Elias, Shannon did some work on that. Said you cannot increase the channel capacity even with noiseless feedback. But Peter Elias said maybe, and he gives some examples, you can simplify the communication scheme. Well, with my first PhD student, I suggested, let's look at this. And I used to encourage my students always to take advanced statistics and math courses. That was the trend at that time. Engineering was more systems engineering was more mathematical. So he studied something in statistics called stochastic approximation. He came back one day and said, I think we can work something out in this. And we did. Okay. Now I must also tell you that the MIT tradition was that each student had a professor advisor. The advisor did his own research. Each student did his own piece of research independent of that, and you wrote papers by yourselves. And so the first 8 or 10 years of my career, almost all of my papers were singly authored. I worked on them. And one exception was this paper with Peter Skalkvik, because I was much more experienced than him and he wasn't quite getting the point and so on. So I cleaned up his paper quite a bit because we got a surprising result. We could signal with a very simple scheme at the maximum possible rate, and the probability of error was normally supposed to decay exponentially. But in this scheme, it was double an exponential to an exponential. So instead of going like this, it went like this. So this is what surprised the community. And it was supposed to be useful in space communications because of this thing. It never got off the ground there because there's a delay in space by the time the signals go back, and that interferes with this scheme. But nowadays, the big thing in the subject is networks of systems. They are short links, and this algorithm is widely used in that. Abbas wrote a book on multi-terminal. Abbas Al-Gamal, the chair, on multi-terminal communications. And one of the results is this old algorithm from 1966.
Now, I'm curious about something. You talked about the philosophy at MIT being independent from graduate students.
Right.
So was this something that you initiated or others at Stanford began to work much more closely with their students where there was collaboration?
It came later. And I was inspired by the solid state group, which was the strongest group at Stanford at the time, because they had teams.
That's right.
Right. But I didn't do that for the first years. My students wrote their own papers, and one or two, a student would do a paper. Jim Amora was a student of mine. Later he became a professor at UCLA, founded a company, and then he was CTO of the Moore Foundation. So he worked with Gordon Moore and so on.
But what got you to change, though? What?
I'll tell you, it took a while. What got me to change was the following. My research led me in a direction where I had to study something called Kalman filters. You may have heard of it. It's a control. Kalman was a control theorist, and he had developed this thing. And that was a kind of signal estimation scheme that was used in this feedback link. You would have to extract information and send it back. And how do you extract the information? More and more information comes in time. You have to update the estimates. And this control people did that. Communications people didn't quite do that. So I needed to learn more about control theory. Now I knew a little bit because one of the nice things when I first came to Stanford was Gene Franklin was head of the group, System Theory Lab, Information Systems
And was
Lab.
Bernie Woodrow involved as well?
Bernie Woodrow was there, Norm Abramson, Bob Newcomb.
Yes.
And we also had people from Aero who did controls like Bob Cannon and so on.
Oh yeah, Bob. Sure.
So Gene had organized a faculty seminar once every 2 weeks or so, where each faculty person would present his area of research in 1 or 2 lectures, what the subject was.
Great.
So I knew a little bit about control from that. But then I told Jim Amora, you've taken courses from Gene Franklin. I don't really have the time to do that. Teach me.
Oh, interesting.
So I can ask you, I like Socratic method. I'm known actually for asking questions. That's
so the student was going to teach
me.
It's like the egg is teaching the chicken.
No, because he knows it better.
Of course.
It's a new subject for me.
Yes,
he took the course and he's studying, and I can help him improve his course.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good.
Exactly, Dijkstra's philosophy. The knowledge and skills have to interact. So Jim Amora did his thesis actually using dynamic programming. And in feedback. He used optimal control. And then I got interested in it for its own sake. And I had met Kalman at that conference in 1960, and he'd given me his famous, it's a very famous paper. You know, he's got the Draper Prize and so on.
Oh.
Yeah. It's widely used, and someone say everybody uses a version of it, a practical version of it, not the original theoretical version. Extended Kalman filter, they call it. So I began to get interested in that subject, and so I started to move slowly to that subject. But then you had to learn not the traditional linear systems that was being taught in EE 240, but something called state space methods. So I gradually began to learn that, and with students, and 5 of my students did research in state space theory.
What year do you think that was, you recall?
That was in the 67, 68 I began.
Uh-huh.
Jim Amar, I think, graduated in 67.
And so were you associated with the systems lab at that point?
No, I was
always
an IS, what we call
ISL, right.
Information System Lab.
Right.
So I began, but then I found that the textbooks in state space started out with half a dozen chapters on mathematics, and then linear algebra, differential equations, and then they got into the applications.
Yes.
And I said, it didn't motivate me, because I'm not interested in math just for its own sake. I want to see, why are we studying this?
Right.
So I developed a new course where the math was just-in-time math. You introduce a math topic and give an application which used that math. Then when a new problem came up, I would introduce a math, not always in this rigorous order. The math needed to do that.
I want to interrupt because I have a question for you from a colleague, actually a student of yours, now a distinguished faculty member, Stephen Boyd.
Yes.
And you knew I had asked some of your colleagues.
Right.
So Stephen, this is perfect. So Stephen wrote this question. He said to ask you this question. He said, nowadays everyone takes it for granted that math is important and can be used to do cool, interesting, and valuable things in such as search, advertising, design, image processing, and the like. That wasn't the case when you started out in your career. What was it like working on math topics well before it was in vogue?
Well, Steve is a young man. And I remember he was a great advisor. His advisor, Charlie Desor.
Oh, I know, yeah, right. Yeah, I know Charlie.
Yeah. Well, I must tell you, if you don't mind my hopping back.
No.
Okay. So let me tell you a small story. I mentioned this conference in Santa Monica that I went to.
Yes.
And Charlie Desor was in the audience. They came down to attend. There were only 12 speakers, but there was audience. He went back to Berkeley, and Shankar Shastri, who's now the dean, there was a student of Desor's. And he told me, Desor came back and said, there's a rising star. And I remembered that because of Boyd.
Yes.
Desor was one of Boyd's advisors.
Yes.
And Desor was a big fan of my book. I wrote a book on linear systems, which changed the way at that time the subject was being taught, because I did this integration of math,
Right.
not just math for itself. And it got me the Education Medal of the IEEE, and was widely used and widely reviewed. So Steve Boyd knows me as when I retired, he made a speech and he said, Desor made me read that book. I loved it. Many people loved it. And that's the book that made Tom famous. So I said to him later, and that book was published in 1980. I said, Tom, Steve, I was a full professor in 1968, and I was a fellow of the IEEE in 1970. So I did a lot of work before this.
It wasn't just that book that made you famous.
So the people control.
That's funny.
No, so what was it like? It's unusual. I might also digress a little bit. MIT, by and large, was non-mathematical. My thesis introduced something called matrix theory, which now it's and linear algebra. Now it's a core curriculum course for undergraduates and EE. At that time, my advisor didn't like it. He said, why are you dragging in this math here, and so on, because they emphasized the physics and understanding, and were very important because they emphasized to me that if you do and get a math result, you must understand the physics behind it, the intuition, why the result comes out the way it is.
Right.
Therefore, in my teaching, and some of my students have pointed this out, they come to me with a result, and I say, And I think Ali said, quote, there's a quotation someone made which I reproduced in my preface. I belong to the school that holds ideas and exposition to be more important than mere results. So Leveray say, he'd come back and say to me, it's a new result, I have so excited. I said, okay, that's great. I began to ask questions, why is this result the way it is? Is it related to some other result that we know? I mean, I know your proof, I can sort of see it, but why, is there another way of thinking about it from a different angle which will illuminate the physical meaning of it and so on? You go back and forth and you simplify the proof. I mean, Ali Syed once said to me, it's a different story, but I had given a problem to some students for a year or two. They didn't make it and so on. So Ali had finished, he was one of my most brilliant students, and he was looking for a new thing. I said, Ali, why don't you look at this problem? Which he came back to me in a couple of days and said, I have a nice solution. I was excited. I took it home, I thought about it, and I called him home, and we talked about it, and 2 pages got boiled down to half a page. So there are some people who get a result, they want to publish it. No, I will hold on to the paper for a long time till we get to the heart of it, the simplest possible way of proving it, the simplest possible way of understanding its meaning. And someone wrote out, when I made first a book proposal, someone wrote a review of it for the publisher. And he said, Kailath's strength is combining the physics and the math together, the physical intuition, engineering intuition, and the math. So that's the way to use math and do it. So in all my work, the math is used, and sometimes very abstract math. In some of my best-known papers, the math was published only 2 years before in the literature.
Oh, interesting.
And it's quite fancy math, actually, used in finance all the time now. It's called martingale theory and Ito integrals. It's a new form of calculus, not the usual Ito calculus. And by the way, Stanford, I taught courses on that as I was doing that work. So what I was saying is that that's to Steve Boyd's question, no, I'm never interested in math for its own sake. And I had to fight a battle at MIT to get this matrix into my work. When I went to JPL, I went to a seminar in another group, a numerical analysis, in a group which was doing the navigation. And they said, there's an interesting formula, matrix formula that we have. We couldn't think of proving it, so we simulated it, and it seemed on a computer, and it seems to work. Later I went to him and I said, the proof is very simple. So the level of knowledge of that kind of math was limited at the time. By the time Stephen is a past master in that.
Yes.
He's teaching it now.
Yes, he is. That's right.
Yeah. So it was a very different era.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So anyway,
the question I was coming to is this idea that you are focused on this rigorous intellectual climate at the interface of engineering and math. That's always been your focal point. Clearly, you've had success. You've had 70 doctoral students, 30 postdocs under your guidance, and we talked a little bit already about your early research and teaching. Can you talk a little bit more as well about this role of the graduate students and how you would get them, what they would do, how you would work with them?
So I began to realize, first of all, that if I wanted to move into new fields, the most efficient way of doing that was to work with a student and later a group of students. Okay, and as I said, so Jim Amora began to teach me control theory, and then over a period of years, and the preface of the book mentions, as I learned linear systems and produced the material for my book, which is half new work and half reasonably well-known stuff, 5 PhD theses went into that development. The results of 5 PhD theses.
Very good.
Yeah. So then the students began to work with each other, write joint papers, and so there was a collegium. And so then most of my papers were with students after that. I have an occasional paper on my own, but was more efficient. And
was that then becoming increasingly more common with your colleagues in the E department?
Yes, you see, right. At that time, for example, when you came up for promotion, one of the questions was, how many single-authored papers do you have?
Oh, right.
Nowadays, almost none.
Right.
The parameters have changed.
So
Because you start to work with students. It's good and bad.
So were you think a pioneer in getting that started here at Stanford in the EE department about having graduate students be more actively engaged with you in writing papers?
No, it was, yes. I think that began to change at Stanford also. I mean, I can't quite say. I mean, Gene Franklin, Stanford had more of a tradition of putting the professors' names on the papers.
Yes.
Partly because it helped to get research money.
Yes. Right.
Because that was the thing. You know, many students people come to me and I say, Jim Omora was my student. Oh, we didn't know that. Because Jim Omora published his papers as Jim Omora.
Right. There would be no connection.
No
to
connection.
Right. I see.
Yeah. So, so let me tell you how the culture began to change.
Yes.
So I got used to working with these students, and one of the students in this group was Martin Morph.
Mm-hmm.
And Morph was a very, very creative individual. But his ideas, he could think matrices in his brain and move them around in his head and so on. But he was one of these people who was a genius in that direction, but couldn't communicate his ideas in the most coherent way, because in his mind it's all there, so on. So, and somehow he did not have, and I'm sorry to say this because I worked very hard to try to get him an appointment at Stanford. He was my postdoc for many years. He did not have the facility of getting feedback from his audience. You know, if you see the student's eyes glaze over, you know that something is happening.
Yes, right.
No, he didn't have that. And I know people I've met who have that lack of, not empathy, but this perception, you know.
Yes.
So with Morph, we began to think of new problem areas, and I built up a group of students, and we wrote a contract. We got a DARPA contract from Bob Kahn to do some direction finding work.
What year was that, do you think?
That was, so Morph graduated in 75, I think. And I began to, my controls work was mostly getting over by then.
Yes.
And I began to move into signal processing and adaptive filtering.
Uh-huh.
So we got and we did some work in that area. And again, I knew nothing about that subject. I collected a group of students, and we worked on that area, and DARPA gave us a contract, because if you support a group, you need larger contracts. And then came the VLSI era.
Mm-hmm.
And Linville and Gibbons had the idea, concept of CIS.
Right.
And now, at that time, a transistor had maybe 100,000 chips, 100,000 transistors on a chip. Mm. That was LSI. And they wanted to do VLSI, which is 1 million transistors on a chip.
Very large scale, yes.
But the question was, if we can do it, who's going to use it, and what do you use it for? But I was already on the XCOM, and I was lab director of ISL. And I said, we can use this kind of processing power, because the algorithms of information theory and signal processing need a lot of data crunching. And now PDP-11 and all have come along, so we can do more. But VLSI will enable us to do much more, because the computers will be much more powerful. So I was one of a group of 4, I think: Jim Gibbons, Jim Meindl,
yes, Jim Meindl, sure.
Mike Flynn, because
right.
computers are the other people who use it, and me. We would go around giving talks to potential donors and Heilmeier and HP and so on. And I would talk about the potential applications of VLSI. And in fact, the very first VLSI contract that DARPA awarded was by Bob Kahn from DARPA. Mm-hmm. The first contract in the country with 3 PIs: Jim Meindl, Forrest Baskett, and I.
Forrest Baskett?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's the computer side.
Yes.
Meindl, the solid state side, and the signal systems
nice
side.
Mix.
It was amazing. Yeah. And let me tell you a story. I knew nothing about VLSI. I mean, I barely knew about what the words were. So I recruited 3 or 4 new students. Sailesh Rao was one of them. H.V. Jagadish is another of them. Juan Jove. I said, and we had a visitor actually from the CIA. But he was interested in he knew my name. He came to work here. There was a student who came to work with me. He started work with me, then he pulled out. Many years later, his name is Jim Holland. I may have got the first. He said, I should tell you, I used a lot of your work and I wrote a lot of reports on it, and here they are. But I used to work for the government or something. And they said, your advisor is Tom Kailath. Well, he has all these international connections. It's not safe.
Really? So he pulled out as a result of that?
He pulled out. But he worked on it.
That's funny.
And he sent me so that so anyway, so we start. So but the CIA, he wasn't with CIA, but CIA has many branches.
Yes.
So Lou Loam was here
Uh-huh.
at the time when Paul Raj was here as a research associate with me also.
Yeah.
It's another story. But we taught ourselves, and we began to find new problems. We all started together, we wrote some joint papers, but then each one got their individual theses. And here, I forgot to tell this story because time was short, and at least I felt time was short.
No, we have plenty of time. Go ahead.
We have, at Jim Mindle's retirement party, Jim Plummer was a student of Jim Mindle's.
I know that, yes.
So when Jim essentially retired from Georgia Tech, Jim Plummer had a reception and party for him here, and many people spoke, including Eli Harari of SanDisk, because Mindle was a consultant for them. And I didn't tell this story then, but I told Jim, we were together on this first VLSI contract, and I remember you saying, why $1 million? We should have 1 billion transistors. And I said, what pipe dreams are those? And now they have 1 trillion or more. Okay. So Sailesh Rao did one of the theses in the VLSI area, how to design systematically, using some mathematics, architectures for signal processing. This was his thesis. At one time we started to write a book on it, but then both of us got too busy, because his thesis could have been the foundation for a good book. These 3 students graduated in the same year. There used to be a Bell Labs recruiter called Scott Knauer. He would come around every year, track the graduate students process. That year, they hired 3 students in this area. Guess who? These 3 students of mine. He went back to his boss and said, aren't there any other fish in the ocean? So
That's funny.
So Scott said to him, I'm showing off a little bit here, but each of Kailath's students does 3 theses by the time they graduate, so you are getting a bargain.
And did you find that the research funding was robust? You were able to get what you needed?
I was able to get research funding.
Mostly DARPA money?
For VLSI, it was DARPA money.
Yes.
Yeah. But not that big, because it was a joint DARPA contract. And at one time I had a large group of about 24 people, 2 secretaries, including Barbara McKee, long-time wonderful secretary of mine.
She helped you build your house.
Yes.
I want to hear about that later.
Yes, right. And she was wonderful. She became part of the family.
Yes.
Yeah. My wife Sarah used to say, Sarah was 21, Barbara was 20 when she got married, and I was 27 or something. We grew up together. We started at Stanford together. Barbara was my first assistant.
Interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, so they went to 3 different groups of Bell Labs. Jagadish Chainfield became a big database expert. Sailesh was in the electronics group in Bell Labs.
Right.
And he was working there with his boss was a friend of mine, Victor Lawrence. And he heard this was the era of HD TV, high definition television. This was a big challenge for America because the Japanese were ahead in HD TV. And there was a big push to have HD TV. Bell Labs was involved in that too. Everyone was. And Arun Netravali, who became president of Bell Labs later, was leading the effort. Shailesh heard that the designers were having trouble meeting the specs for one of the HD TV chips. So he said to his buddy, Marty Hellman, my thesis was related to how you design these chips. Let us spend some time on it. And they persuaded Brian Acland, their boss, to get some time off. In a few months, they came up with a design which now made the front page of the Homedale magazine, because now the numbers are not in my head, and we couldn't find, Shailesh and I couldn't find this issue again, the Bell Labs issue. It had maybe 2/3 the power, 2/3 the area, 3/4 of the power, and other restrictions, and it met all the specs. Amazing. And the people were amazed. They said, here are designers with 10 years experience, they couldn't do it. And here are two kids with no background in the field, and they managed to do this. Okay. So then other people would come to Marty and Shailesh and Marty, and say, hey, this is the next most important chip in Bell Labs. Will you help us design it? They did that. After 2 or 3, they said, why are we doing this on an MTS salary?
We should finally figure it out. Yes.
Yeah, we should quit. So they went to Bob Luckey. You may know the name. He was the executive director in that communications research, and said, we're leaving. He said, no, it's a mistake, and so on. We'll promote you. They put them at the top of the salary scale, and so on. They did. So they stayed on another 6 months. They said, no, we are quitting. They went back. Bob Luckey said, okay, you go. But, we're not going to give you any business. You go, and so on. Well, Bell Labs did give they formed a company called SDEI, Silicon Design Experts, Inc. And Bell Labs gave them business. And they did well enough that they were acquired by Level 1 and then acquired by Intel.
That's a nice progression.
Yeah, it was a nice progression. So Shailesh did well. He's one of my good students.
In reflecting on, that's a very good example of, what's your take on how Stanford encourages those kinds of activities?
Now
talk about
in
that?
this case, of course, Stanford Stanford is great at that. Stanford's great. It took a while for them to put some restrictions in, like you shouldn't ask your PhD students to do work that's company related.
That's correct. Right.
And they put some legitimate bounds on it. But no, Stanford, that's one of our strengths.
Were you ever involved with Office of Technology Licensing in any manner? The folks who would...
Oh, yes. OTL.
Yes, OTL, right.
Yeah, not Niels Reimers.
Yeah, Niels, right.
Was a pioneer.
He was the initial director and founder of
right. He was a neighbor of ours at Cathcart.
Because OTL has been so instrumental in helping faculty members and students spin out their good ideas and the patents and inventions and things. It's been, I think, a real strength of Stanford.
No, it has been wonderful, OTL. But, they took some of my patents, only 1 or 2 are licensed. Paul Raj is essentially one of the key founders of a field called MIMO, which is big and wide. It means using multiple antennas to improve to get, every cell phone has 3 antennas on it. So that if you only had 1 antenna, it gives you 3 times the capacity. The patent has been violated, and Paul Raj made a lot of money being a legal expert on these.
But Stanford would not go after them?
Stanford would not go after.
I wonder why. I don't know the rationale.
No, I think first of all, they don't want to give the image that Stanford is, I don't know all the reasons. Money grabbing and...
litigious, they want to get... I don't know.
Yeah, they want to get... And litigation's expensive and drags on for years.
And you may not win.
And you may not win.
Right.
You may not win. So OTL has been... And then all the universities have copied OTL.
That's correct. In fact, when Niels began, he was asked to go to other universities to give advice and guidance and start... and many schools have put that in play.
MIT was one of the first.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Now, I want to go back to you when you became director of the Information Systems Lab. Yes. What was that experience like? How did that evolve and grow during the time you were there?
Yeah. I became director in 1971, I think.
Yes, I think.
Yes, right.
That's correct. That's what I had.
I'd actually been asked to do that by Bill Rambo. Bill Rambo was the head of ERL at the time.
I have you as director from 81 to 87. Was it?
No, that was chair, associate chair.
Oh, that's chair. I'm sorry, you're right. So you had lab before that. That's
71
Yes.
to 81 or
Yes.
82. 10 years I was lab director.
That's correct.
Always felt that one should not hold an admin position for more than 10 years. My own view. I changed. When you're a young person, you don't think administration is important. I'm wiser now. A good administration, as at Stanford, can make a huge difference. Bad
Absolutely.
administration can ruin a place quickly.
That's correct. I've always been appreciative of most of the administration of Stanford is a hands-off.
Right.
Give people the right resources and tools and turn them loose.
Right.
Right.
And that Stanford is, including, as I said, the PhD education, all that. Don't put too many burdens, too many restrictions, and so on. The stars will do well. The average will do okay too. Stanford is, but don't burden everyone. Don't drag the whole cohort down in order to bring the bot. I mean, this is patronizing. It may sound, but you can't. You got to know where to focus your major energies.
I was always had admiration for Jim Gibbons and for Jim Plummer, whose job they felt was always sort of at the bottom of the pyramid, pushing faculty out.
Yes, right.
They're the foundation to help faculty members
Right.
succeed. It's not top down.
Exactly.
Right, right.
Exactly.
That's
They're
very
not
impressive.
the boss telling you.
No,
they're,
no.
Right.
Right.
No, that's exactly pushing. And Gene Franklin used to say that too. He was lab director before
Right.
I was.
So what happened during that era when you were? Can you
It was
reflect
very
on that?
interesting. I must say again, ISL turned out to be one of the strongest labs on campus at that time. And John Linville and I had some disagreements about it, but he helped me a lot also. And when I stepped down as lab director, I said I was going to step down. Linville, in his office, said to me, I think you've done a great job. It could be matched perhaps, but not exceeded. So for me, I always regard that as very high praise.
That is very high praise, right?
Because I worked hard at being lab director.
Right.
And I still continue to say, and Barbara McKee carried a huge load because I had all this admin work. By then we began to get the demand for more. When I started at Stanford, it only took 4 letters to get an appointment.
Really?
I was recently, Dave Lowenberger was 4 letters. I think they got 3, or they only got 2 or 3 for me.
Wow. That's amazing.
And I believe in it. I think 12 is, in my own view, is overkill. But I'm in a minority here.
Well, you served on the executive committee of the
Also,
department, so
yes.
you were actively engaged in the recruitment
Yeah, I was.
and hiring.
And right. I mean, John Hennessy, I remember all his papers. I found them in my files.
It's a good thing you hired him.
Yeah. And, we promoted him rapidly.
Yes, I think the word is meteoric.
Meteoric. But it was clear. It was clear.
So the lab, when
the lab, there were only 3 full professors, Gene Franklin, Bernie Woodrow, and me.
Yes.
And Woodrow I knew at MIT, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Because he got his PhD in 59.
Uh-huh.
In 57 or something. Then he taught for a couple of years at MIT, and I attended one of his seminars.
How could you hear Bernie? He's so soft-spoken. I always would, when I was working with Bernie, I'd always have to lean in.
Right. But Bernie always, he had his own ideas, which are good ideas. I mean, his LMS algorithm is used all over the world, and every naval ship has it.
That's
and so
right.
on. So,
Right.
LMS. But I remember a seminar which he presented at MIT, and I was only a graduate student attending it. And he was it was a shock to me, very aggressively questioned by the faculty.
Oh.
Because it was early ideas, and, Bernie was soft-spoken and so on.
Yes.
So Shannon was in the audience asking questions. This pattern recognition, not quite Bernie's field, but he had ideas in it, and so on. So then Bernie came to Stanford because his advisor was Bill Linville, John's brother.
His brother, his twin brother.
Yeah.
Yes, oh, I
So
didn't know.
Bernie. So Bernie was here, and actually Bernie came, I think, in 59, and or maybe 61. I'm not sure. I came in 63.
When were you promoted to full professor?
68.
So that's going from
That was
associate
pretty
to
fast,
that's
too.
really fast.
Yeah.
That's good. You were doing the right things, and
right.
recognizes doing the right things.
Right.
That is a very
That was quick.
That's a meteoric rise right
that
there,
was,
there as well.
actually.
But then as you had your lab, you had your students, you were teaching, you were doing research.
Right.
But then you took on this other role of being
Yes, of
doing
being
administrator
lab
in the
director.
department.
Yeah.
And what was
right.
that like?
It took a lot of time. And, I'm a bit of a workaholic. So I think the family suffered from it because I would spend a lot of time at this.
Was
And
John
Sarah-
still chair? John Linville?
John was chair.
And
John was chair. John was chair till,
Joe
till Bob
Goodman
White became.
Bob White, then Joe Goodman after that, I think.
And Joe Goodman after Bob
Right,
White,
right.
I think, yeah.
So you were there during John's time, John Linville's
I was
time.
there, yeah. I was on the XCOM with
Yeah,
John.
right.
Yeah.
So
And he helped me, I will tell
Go
you
ahead,
in many
yeah.
ways, yeah. So there were only 3 full professors. And 10 years later, I think there were 7 or 8. Because I recruited and hired people like Joe Goodman, Marty Hellman, not I recruited, I mean they came.
Yeah, they came with
Joe
the
was
era.
here already.
Yes.
Joe's thesis was classified,
Oh, really?
and I don't know if it's even released now.
Really?
Yeah.
Well.
It wasn't allowed. I mean, later we banned all that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And when SRI was spun out.
Right, okay.
yeah.
So here were some of the faculty that Marty Hellman, Tom Cover. Tom Cover.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but he was already here. Tom Cover was Norm Abramson's star student, and he graduated in '64 and joined the faculty. And Tom and I were quite close. He was in information theory.
I want to say, Marty Hellman wrote me that when I asked for advice, he said, he was the one who said, make sure to ask about building a house on campus. He said, if you want a funny story, tell him. We'll hold that for later.
I don't know why Hellman knows about it. Maybe he has an
Yeah, he
angle
must
on
have known something about it. So, okay, so you had some good people coming in at that time.
No, that's right. I mean, Marty Hellman was Tom Cover's student. He went away to IBM and MIT, and we hired him back. And that was in my watch. So, and I think when I left, Marty was still associate professor. So we strengthened ISL. And let me tell you one of the things. VLSI was coming on the scene in the early 80s. I said these students graduated in 84, 85. How did that happen? There were 2 young guys called Newkirk and Matthews. I don't know if you remember them.
No.
And they said there's a new way of designing integrated circuits invented by Carver Mead and Lynn Conway. And we would like to teach a course in that. And now I was persuaded. I mean, I was involved in telling people why VLSI should be important because we can use it. And so there was a student of mine, S.Y. Kung, and he went to USC, and Abbas El Gamal was Cover's student. And I advised them to go into VLSI.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right.
Right.
And then Abbas came back here
Right.
and worked in VLSI.
Right.
So what was I saying? So I went to John Linville, and Abbas was here back already. And I said, John, we need some appointments in this space. 2 of them may be temporary, but 1 may be more. So can we recruit Abbas and John Newkirk and Rob Matthews? And Rob and Newkirk will co-teach a VLSI design course.
Good.
The CS course.
Yes.
John agreed. Those days were not so democratic and bureaucratic. He could take that decision.
Yes.
It was a risk. But that's how, that was the German philosophy and so on, that, you see a new area, you need to build it up, do something. And so ISL got 3 appointments.
That's amazing.
You can't get it these days.
No, of course not.
It's-
But what you said something I think is important that I've seen this in my time at Stanford, and that is the push to be innovative and clever and creative, and don't let things hold you back. And Stanford is a good environment for making that happen. Other schools, no.
Yeah.
But here, it gives you as a faculty member, a researcher, a student, the latitude to be clever, creative, innovative.
Right.
And if you make mistakes, well, you made a mistake. What'd you learn from it? Now go do something else.
No, that is, that's the Silicon Valley ethos.
Right, of
Failure
course it
is a
is.
badge of honor, not
Right.
Because provided you learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, you don't want to repeat the mistakes.
Right,
That's absolutely
yeah,
right.
right, yeah.
But it sounded like you were in that era really had some important hires
as
coming
I said,
in.
the group structure came to me from solid state.
Right.
That inspiration for that kind of thing. And failure, when we entered VLSI, who knew whether we would succeed? We didn't, and it happened later in manufacturing, and I got into manufacturing.
Right, and I want to come to that. So
yeah, right.
We're reaching a logical break. We thought we'd end at 4 o'clock.
Okay, good.
If this is okay with you.
It's okay. I wanted to mention that Bob Gray had joined on the faculty.
Go ahead, let's go, yeah.
Yeah, and I was lab director when his promotion had come up, and he didn't make it the first time.
Oh.
Yeah. And then I think I had a role in, I gave him an idea for his research, and Bob is a great worker and so on. And the next year he was ready and he sailed through. So I worked hard at it, and I got a lot of letters from people because one of my strengths is I have a big network because I have worked in different fields. So I can call people, get information. So we made very strong cases. And I don't think, and I hired John Gill.
Oh, you did?
Away from Berkeley.
Yes.
Yeah.
At that era, was there much integration between other departments? So presumably EE and CS, well, CS was forming, but
right.
It was still compartmentalized.
It was. Now, Ed McCluskey was in ISL for a year or so, so in the old lab with Gene Franklin.
Yes, right.
Then he formed what's called DSL, Digital Systems.
Right.
And that eventually became part of CS was already there. George Forsyth had the CS department.
But was there much at that point?
No,
were they doing joint
much.
Appointments and things?
No, not at that
so
time.
quite discreet from each other.
Quite discreet, yeah.
Because the era is changing now around finding people to work together from a range of disciplines around a common problem.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And we had, Balaji was he's a joint CS.
That's right.
And then Andrea Montanari is statistics.
Oh, yes.
And so
some good people doing
people.
that.
So Bob Gray's promotion. So I introduced computers into the EE department.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. Because the following, Jim Meindl used to distribute equipment money every year because he had a grant, and all the labs would get it, but not ISL because we have paper and pencil. So I said to Jim, no, we can get computers. And John Gill encouraged me. So he gave me money for computers. We bought a PDP 11 or something.
Yes, right.
John Gill loves computers. He ran it, and we were the first lab to have computers.
No kidding. You must have been a rarity, a true rarity. I mean, not just here, but around the country as well.
Because I could not program.
So that was actually very clever when you think about it. And back then, those were reasonably primitive machines. But
No, let me tell you, Bob Gray was very opposed to it.
Bob Gray was?
Yes. No, because it sounds surprising, because he became one of the biggest users of computers.
I know Bob. I can't believe he would be able to.
No, he was opposed to it. He said, why do we need computers and so on? This is a way.
Bob Gray said that.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So, it changed attitudes.
What changed his mind finally?
No, I think he was doing data compression kinds of things, and he began to do things, and the students push you also. Because the students know more about it than you do.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I've seen that here in Stanford repeatedly. Sometimes the students are leading the faculty members into the new areas, new equipment, new systems, doing that. And that's again bringing in good, smart students who can do that.
Unix was pushed into us by students.
Very interesting.
So anyway.
All right. So Tom, what I'd like to do is we'll stop here. I think we have, if you're open for it, we'll schedule another
session. I'm happy.
Session.
I think I'm enjoying it. I hope you're not too bored with it.
I hope I'm not looking bored because I am not.
No.